Perfect. Yeah, so like I said, I'm Chris Belfield. I work here in the education sector, but today I'm going to talk about some research some colleagues and I have been doing over many years now, actually. Well, not me for so long, but them for a lot longer, on measuring inequality and poverty in the UK. And before I get to that, I'm going to start about talking about how we measure living standards in the UK. So what do we use for if we're talking about inequality between people that have different levels of living standards, then first of all we need to measure what those living standards are, and the same when we get to poverty if I have enough time at the end of the lecture. But then we want to talk about people that have living standards below a certain poverty line, for example, but we still need to measure living standards before we get there. And I'm going to do that using income. So we have a household survey which measures income in the UK. But I'm going to talk a little bit about why we might want to use income, why we might not want to use income, why we might want to use some alternative measures instead. Then I'm going to go on to actually talk about what's happened to income inequality, look at how this has changed over recent years, and look at digging a little bit deeper below just the headline measure of inequality to look at how it differs across the age distribution. Before, if I have enough time, I'll move on to look at measures of income poverty and how they were particularly sensitive to how we treat housing costs during and since the recession. But I must state, if you have any questions, just shout out throughout the presentation, and I'll do my best to answer them. Or if not, I'll hang around for a little bit during your break after this, so we can have a chat afterwards if there's anything in any more depth that you want to discuss. But first, why would we want to use income as a measure of living standards? Well, it's quite intuitive to begin with. We might think that income represents the level of resources that a family or a household has, and so, this provides a good indicator of how much, what the level of living standards they'll be able to afford is. But that's not necessarily what we always want to look at. Often, I'm sure you'll know from studying economics and the like, that we put consumption in utility functions. We care about how much somebody actually consumes. We don't necessarily care about how much income they had to consume because of various reasons, like saving over time or choices about not wanting to consume other things. So it's not necessarily that we think income is the be-all and end-all of living standards. It's not this thing that we always want to measure, but it's actually the easiest thing to measure. Measuring somebody's income's easy. You just add up all of the different sources of income they have. Well, it's not that easy. We have a massive survey which does it, but you add up all of these different sources of income and you come out at the end with somebody's net household income. As I'll come on to later, we measure income at the household level. Measuring somebody's consumption is conceptually a lot harder. How do you go about actually measuring someone's consumption? Well, the way in which the surveys which do that, the way they do this is they basically create a consumption diary. So they say, what did you consume during this period? So usually over a week. So you ask somebody to write down everything they buy during a week. And that's obviously a lot more data, so a lot more survey time intensive than just, what was your earnings last year? What was your income from self-employment? What did you get from benefits? Because they have to actually record something over the whole week. And even then, that's not ideal. We've measured the amount that they consumed within a week, but there's some purchases that you want to consider within consumption, which you don't buy on a weekly basis. You don't buy a car every week. You don't buy a washing machine every week. And these are things that we may want to include in a measure of consumption that you're even going to miss using this diary measure of consumption. But we've got these two potential measures of measuring living standards, and I think it's important, as you'll see from this graph, to compare how the two different measures of living standards, to look at how the two measures of living standards compare. So what I'm doing here is lining people up on the x-axis in terms of the amount of income that the household receives from various sources, and dividing those up into, say, £10 groups. So the people who have the lowest income are over on the left-hand side, and people with the most income are over here on the right-hand side. And then taking that group of £10 groups of income, looking at how much consumption that household was recorded as having in the same year. So we've got the median expenditure for that individual group. And as you can see, this graph looks slightly odd. You'd expect households with more income to have more consumption as they grow over time. So this, I should say, this comes from data 2012 and comes from a survey which measures both consumption and income from the living costs and food survey. So yeah, you'd expect them to increase monotonically over time. So basically what you see once you get beyond the £100 of income mark, the more income a household has, the more they appear to be consuming. But that's not what you see. You see this big upwards tick to the right, to the bottom of the income distribution. That actually people in the poorest households in terms of income have a similar level of consumption to those around the median. This isn't the whole income distribution, this is just the bottom half, but we see that those in the poorest households are consuming about £380, £400 a week, which is similar to those that have about £500 a week in income in 2012. Now, why might this be the case? This isn't something we would expect to see. There are two widely cited reasons for why you get this uptick. And the first one is just a measurement error issue. We don't accurately measure the amount of consumption that somebody has. We don't accurately measure the amount of income somebody has to like 100% accuracy. So there's some measurement error which causes some mean reversion. And so if we're mismeasuring your income, actually you're a high income household, and we measure your consumption correctly, then you're going to be a low income household in terms of income, low income household, but a high consumption household, and might be driving some of this uptick at the bottom of the distribution. The other reason is consumption smoothing over time. People don't consume their entire income in any given week, in any given year, and people may save for a rainy day so that when they lose their job or face another sort of income shock, they can maintain a similar level of consumption. So there might be temporarily poor income households at the bottom of this distribution, but they maintain the same high level of consumption because they've saved for those eventualities. So if we care about how much people are consuming rather than how much resources they have, then, or rather, because we're not including the being able to consume out of savings in the measure of income, we can see that just focusing on income entirely is imperfect. But as I said, it's the easiest way of measuring living standards, and it does provide an overall general proxy for what we might be interested in. Another way of getting at what we might be interested in is looking at a measure of material deprivation. And this comes from the same survey that I'm going to be talking about today. And they ask families a series of questions about what you can and what you can't afford. So, for an example, can you afford a warm winter coat? Can you afford to, if you had an unexpected expense of £200, would you be able to meet that? Would you be able to go on a holiday, for example? And then the answers to these questions are weighted by how many people in the overall population are deprived of, say, the warm winter coat. And then you get an index score of between 0 and 100. And the higher the score, the more deprived you are. And if you have a score of more than 25, then you're deemed to be materially deprived. And so because we get this from the same survey of income, we can do the same thing that we did with consumption, and we can see the proportion of people in each vantile, so the 20th of the distribution, that were deemed to be materially deprived. And although the tick is now inverted, we see basically the same pattern. Those that are the poorest in terms of income aren't the most likely to be materially deprived in terms of this other measure. So again, reiterating this point that income isn't necessarily a perfect measure of perfect measure of living standards. However, it's the best one we have, and so I'm going to plough on anyway. So we measure income using a survey called Households Below Average Income, which is a terribly named survey because in order to know average income, you have to measure everybody's income. So it obviously includes the whole distribution, not just those below average income. That comes from based on the data, the Family Resources Survey, which has about 20,000 households in the UK. And that means that all of our estimates are subject to sampling error. Whenever you hear what median income in the UK is being given as, it should be surrounded by a confidence interval. We don't know that for sure. We haven't measured everybody's income in the UK. We've only measured 20,000 households, and we believe that to be representative of the overall population. We do use sampling weights to gross it up to match certain desirable characteristics of the overall population, but that's not too important. We measure income net of taxes and benefits. So in terms of measure of income, what we care about is the amount of resources that the household has available. So we don't care about the amount that they're paying in tax. And for much of this presentation, I don't care necessarily about where that income came from. So we're including benefits as well as earned income from self-employment or just direct earnings. We're measuring income at the household level. That's important for some of these measures of inequality, because measuring income at the household level, we implicitly assume that all different members of the household, which has different levels of earnings, different levels of other income, they're sharing the income and they all achieve the same standard of living as each other. If that's not the case, for some circumstances you may believe that that's quite likely. If you have a family with 2 parents, 2 children, the children don't have any earnings, the parents have quite a lot of earnings, you'd expect the parents to share some of their earnings with their own children. So that might seem reasonable. But if you have a house of, say, 5 students, I live with 4 of my other friends, 2 of which are bankers, they definitely don't share their incomes with me. So we might be underestimating the overall level of inequality because we've assumed that I'm sharing my income with some bankers, and we have the same level of income, same level of living standards, but we don't. They they go out to the pub a lot more than I do. We also adjust it for inflation to get consistent over time. You'd think that would be really boring. Well, it is quite boring, but it's actually really important because the official statistics adjust for inflation using the inflation measure called RPI, the Retail Price Index. However, it was recently declassified as a national statistic because it's now thought to systematically and significantly overstate the rate of inflation due to something called the formula effect. If you use the same basket of goods using the RPI methodology and the CPI methodology, RPI would give you an inflation rate of around 1% higher. And this isn't desirable. We think that 1% isn't real inflation. It's due to some small errors in the way in which RPI is calculated. If you want to go into that in more detail, I can point you in the direction of somebody that likes talking about it.
Which one did you say it's gone again? Was it CPI or RPI?
RPI has been declassified as an official statistic. So in the official statistics of the households below average income, so in terms of what you will see in DWP's report of median income, which is released every year, they still use RPI as deflation. They are under consultation of changing that. In our reports and in much of what I'll show you today, we've changed to use an alternative measure based on CPI, but not exactly CPI, because we think that more accurately represents the actual level of inflation seen in the economy. To show you how important this is median income since 1997-98 up to the latest data that's available in 2013-14, and how that's indexed to 100, and to see how that's changed over the last 16 or so years. And as I said, median income should always be surrounded by a confidence interval because of sampling error. I haven't done that here, and I apologise. But basically, over this 15-year period, we saw quite rapid 16-year period, rapid growth in the late 90s, early 2000s, followed by stagnant growth in the mid-2000s, fall during the recession, and the fall has stopped in the last couple of years of data. Obviously, we're now in 2016. This is quite out of date. That's because it takes quite a long time for this data to be cleaned and vetted and published. Now, if I use the measure of preferred measure of inflation that we use in our report, the CPI adjusted measure of inflation, the picture looks a whole lot better. Rather than living standards incomes having only increased by 12% over the last 16 years, they've instead increased by 25%. The slowdown of income in the mid-2000s was less dramatic. The fall was smaller, and actually we've returned to growth in the latest 2 years of data. So controlling for inflation is very important, as I'm sure you know, but actually the specifics of controlling for inflation in the right way is also very important. We also adjust for household size. We're using a household measure of income. We do what's called equivalization. So a bigger household with more people in, needs a higher level of income to achieve the same standard of living as a smaller household. And we essentially adjust for that. And that means that by adjusting for that, you control for changes in household size over time. And this just gives you an indication of how important that it's important to do that too. If you unequivalize, if you don't adjust for changes in household size, the growth in income over the very long run looks slightly less good because household size has gotten smaller over the last 30 or 40 years. But moving on to income inequality, so actually get on to some analysis. The way in which I'm going to picture this to begin with is line everybody up in terms of their weekly income again, so dividing it up into £10 intervals. And the poorest people on the left-hand side, richest people on the right-hand side, and look at the number of people we have in each of those pools. So median income in 2013-14 was £453 per week for a childless couple. So if you had 2 children, you would have needed more income than that to achieve this, to be at the median, because we've adjusted for the fact that you had more people in your household. And in the group between £440 per week and £450 per week, there are about 1 million people. So that's what this bar indicates. And I can then fill in the rest of the income distribution around that. So we see a nice little skewed bell curve. We just have a couple of weird things. It's top coded at 1500 for this purpose, and there's a bunch of people who report having negative income. We're not interested in that for the moment, so we've just given them 0. So that explains the spike. So basically, you see median income around 440, and then it tails off with some people with higher incomes. This is the same graph, just on a slightly different axis because someone else drew it for me. And this is the same graph in 1961, back when median income was only £170. And what's going to happen now is we're going to slowly tick through the years to see what's happened to the income distribution over the last 40 years. So during the 1960s, there's a gradual shift to the right. So median income was increasing slowly. Right at the beginning of the 1970s, there was a recession. Median income began to cease. Growth in median income slowed down, so nothing much happens during the 70s at all. But now we hit the 1980s and a lot begins to happen. So first of all, median income begins to rise, but also we see this big stretching out of the income distribution. This is the big rise in inequality that we see during the 1980s. Then during the 1990s, we maintain this stretched out measure of the income distribution, but we begin to shift it to the right. Income growth continues in the 1990s. And as we bring up to present day, as I mentioned, that income growth slows down slightly in the mid-2000s, and as we get up to 2008, 2009, 2010, the income growth begins to stop. We see a small fall in median income, and then brings us back up to the graph we had for the present day. So that's everything that's happened to the income distribution in the last 42 years. To go a little bit slower, we can see those effects I was describing overlaid on one another. So this is the decade between 1963 and 1973. As you can see, quite a condensed distribution of income, slight move to the right as median income rose during that decade. Then, not much happens at all in the 1970s. There isn't much growth, there isn't much change in inequality. Basically, in terms of this presentation, it's a lost decade. Then between 1983 and 1993, there's this big shift to the right, this big spreading out, and that's the big increase in inequality that was seen during the 1980s. And then, as I said, between 1993 and 1993 and 2003, we see a continued shift to the right-hand side as incomes continue to grow during that period. And over the most recent decade, there's some small growth, but it hasn't been as dramatic as it was over the previous decade. So in a sense, as I said, that's, to an extent, the entire income distribution should be everything that you need to know about inequality in some respects. But it's very difficult to take that all in. I showed you 42 graphs in the space of under a minute and had to speak very rapidly over the top of them in order to make any sense. So when we're measuring inequality, what we typically use is another measure which summarises the level of inequality in the economy. So, and I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of the Gini coefficient. To calculate this, we line up people in terms of their income, the lowest income on the left-hand side, the highest income on the right-hand side, and calculate the cumulative portion of the overall income in the population that proportion of the population account for, drawing the Lorenz curve here, and the Gini coefficient is calculated as the area of A over the total area on the curve. So it will be 0 if we had perfect equality and 1 if we had perfect inequality, because you can see with the relevant changes in the areas. For the more mathematically inclined, if you want to calculate it like this, you can. That's just how we actually go about calculating from the data, rather than drawing neat Lorenz curves and shading in the areas. We use a boring mathematical formula. But then to explain what's happened to the Gini over time. So I'm starting in 1979 because that's when the interesting stuff starts to happen. As I said, nothing really happened in the 1960s in terms of inequality, and nothing happened at all in the 1970s.
It was before or after redistribution?
Before or after tax. Yeah. So this is after tax. So as I said, the household incomes are measured net of taxes and benefits. In a minute, I'm going to go on to talk about the effect the tax and benefit system has had on the Gini coefficient. But this is using net incomes to measure Gini coefficient. So when I line people up in terms of income here, it's using net income. When I calculate the share of income that's used, it's net income as well. Yes?
So just to go back to the chart, which is actually really interesting, is what that's essentially saying is that in the 60s and 70s, the population was much more equal. There was much less
inequality.
Inequality, but
Yeah.
Difference of incomes, and then it's in the sort of 80s and 90s that.
Yeah, so you can see the same.
Much higher incomes.
So you can see the same thing on this graph. So if I was to draw this back further, we've got a Gini coefficient of about 0.25, and then you see this big rise in the 1980s, which is essentially the same thing as showing that income distribution which massively spread out. This is a summary statistic which represents the level of dispersion.
The charts are much more interesting, I think.
I agree, which is why I showed them. But this is also, you can't put 62 charts in a report, so we have to put something like this. But you can then see that the line gets a lot flatter, and that's where the income distribution was just gradually shifting to the right side. Small increases in inequality over the last couple of decades, bringing us up to 2009, 2010. But this brings us on to why did inequality rise so dramatically during the 1980s? Has anyone got any ideas? I have 4 potential explanations.
Big Bang in the city.
Big Bang in the city. So I think that pretty much closely relates to my first one. So skills bias, technological change, as documented by Acemoglu. Basically, there's lots of technological change which some argue was biased in terms of the people who are already the high-skilled people. It increased the productivity of the high-skilled, and increase the earnings of the high skilled, because the high skilled were already the most highly paid. It just increased their earnings and stretched out the income distribution. During the 1970s and 1980s, there was also a weakening of labour market institutions, of trade unions. I'm going to quickly skip over this, but there's a bunch of research which essentially says, these graphs and this analysis says, trade unions were more important for increasing the wages of those towards the bottom of the wage distribution than those at the top, as would be intuitive. If trade unions are more important for raising wages at the bottom of the income distribution, if you remove them, then it's going to have a more negative impact on those at the bottom of the distribution. It's going to increase inequality. Oh, that's okay. There's also an idea that we're measuring household income, as I mentioned at the beginning, and Paul, Gregg and Wandsworth found that there was an increase in inequality in employment status across households. So obviously, in the economy, people who are employed have more income than people who aren't employed. And over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a more grouping of those people who are employed together. So you have more households where both people are employed, or both adults are employed, and you have more households which are workless where nobody's employed. So whereas in the 1960s, you may have had more equal distribution where one person is employed in every household, as you've had this increase in inequality in employment status, it brings with it an increase in inequality in household income. Finally, changes in tax and benefit systems. This is what you were talking about. Now, this is a great graph, which is a lot of work has gone into, which I did none of. But basically, if we took the tax and benefit system as it was in 2009 and applied that to the income distribution, or the population of people that we measured in this survey sample, in each of the other years, now we're looking at what impact replacing that 2009 tax and benefit system with the actual tax and benefit system that was in place in that year. What impact does that have on the Gini coefficient? So in 1978, by taking the 2009 tax and benefit system and replacing it with the actual tax and benefit system they had in 1978, that has the effect of increasing the Gini coefficient by about 0.3. So, did changing the tax and benefit system have a big impact on this big increase in inequality that we saw over that period? Well, maybe not. It's about 0.3 throughout the period where inequality was rising. You could argue this spike here coincides with some of the growth in inequality in the 1980s. So maybe the tax and benefit system was becoming less redistributive during the middle of the 1980s, and that constituted some of the rise in inequality seen over that period. And the tax and benefit system then became fairly dramatically more redistributed during the late 1990s and the early 2000s due to increases in child tax credit available to low-income working families. So that brings us up to 2009-10, which is obviously after the recession started, but it's before the fall in incomes began that was caused by the recession. So you'd have seen, I very quickly breezed over it in the first graph I had with the two different inflation measures. Incomes only began to fall after 2009-10. They continued to grow, albeit slowly, for the first 2 years of the recent recession. But income inequality then fell during the recession quite dramatically for a couple of years, and then stabilised at a slightly lower level. I mean, these are small changes, but we can see why this change happens. So here I'm lining people up again in terms of their income. You tend to do that a lot when you're talking about inequality. And looking at, by each percentile of the income distribution, what change did they see in their level of income over the period 2007-8 to 2013-14. And we can see that those at the very bottom of the income distribution saw actually reasonable rises in real income over that period. And this is over the period where incomes over the whole population were falling. As you can see at the top of the distribution there are falls, middle of the distribution it's relatively stable. And this is obviously what drives the fall in inequality. If the people at the bottom of the distribution have incomes growing and at the top they have it falling, inequality overall is going to go down. So why did this happen? Well, what drove the fall in incomes over the whole distribution was a fall in wages and a fall in the employment rate. Those at the bottom of the distribution are less reliant on employment income for a share of their income. They're more reliant on benefits, which over the period up until 2012-13, 2013-14 were much more stable than earnings. So there were benefit increases in real terms at the early parts of the recession, and this is what drives this growth here. Whereas those at the top of the distribution who don't receive as much benefits and do receive more of their income from earnings and work, when they faced wage cuts or loss, were more likely to lose their job. They saw these falls in income. And actually, if you take the later period, it looks a lot more flat. So this is just focusing on the period since 2009-10, ignoring the first 3 years of the recession. And that's when the benefit rises began to stop and the employment rate began to stabilise. And you see a much more flat move across the flat distribution across the income distribution. And that's basically explaining this flat part of the line here. So the Gini coefficient was one headline measure of inequality. As I showed you, 42 graphs or whatever it was, 52 graphs. And I summarised that in a single line where I take the whole income distribution and calculated the measure of dispersion using this Gini coefficient. But in a sense, that misses a lot of the story. Like, I showed you a lot of data, a lot of information about a lot of households, and I summarised it in one number for each year. Now, there are other ways in which we can create headline measures of inequality, and an alternative measure is the 90-10 income ratio. So this basically tracks the Gini coefficient. What the 90-10 income ratio does is takes the income of the 90th richest, the 10th richest household and the 90th richest households and calculates the ratio between the two of them. So this is saying that in 1961, the 10th richest household had 3 times the income of the 90th richest household. And then during the 1980s, we see the same rise in inequality that we see in terms of the Gini coefficient. By about 1990, it's about 4.3 times. And actually, over the last 20 years, whereas the Gini coefficient was flat, maybe slightly rising, the 90-10 income ratio was falling. So these two different headline measures of inequality present a slightly different picture over the last 2 years. And this begs the question of why is this happening? And the answer is the top 1%. So if the top 1% get richer and richer over time, the 90-10 income ratio doesn't care about that because they're above the 10th richest person. They're already in the top 1 percentile, so they're not coming into our measure of either the 10th richest person or the 90th richest household. So this rise that we see from 1980s, 1990s of the share of income that's received by the top 1% doesn't affect the 90-10 income ratio, but it will affect the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient, because the Gini coefficient includes everybody in the income distribution. So that's what's explaining this distinction between the Gini and the 90-10 in the last 10 years. I have 10 more minutes. I'm not going to get on to talk about poverty. If you really want to talk about poverty, I will hang around a bit during the break and we can discuss some of the things I have to say on it. Or you can read our report, which is available online. But there's also these headline measures of inequality miss another quite interesting and quite important measure of inequality. We focused on inequality in the whole distribution. And in a sense, if we think about inequality by age, we can think about these headline measures of inequality as conflating two different types of inequality. Under inequality just between all households, within that there is inequality between households of the same age, so how much more is somebody living in a household of between the ages of 25 and 30 earning than somebody else in the same age bracket. Or, and it conflates this with the other idea of inequality, which is inequality between people of different ages. So on average, are 20-year-olds much richer or much poorer than 80-year-olds, or much richer or much poorer than 60-year-olds? So what I'm going to do here is split out these two measures of inequality and look at how each of them have changed over time. So first, looking at 1978-79, I'm now going to look at inequality across ages. So what I've done here is I've taken the median income of each of these groups, so the median income of 25 to 30-year-olds in 97, 98, and compared that to the median income of the whole population. So 30 to 34-year-olds are slightly richer on average than the entire population. And for example, pensioners are a lot poorer in 1978 to 79. You may raise the question of why do we have a load of income for 0 to 4-year-olds? They very rarely work. But this is how I explained at the very beginning. We've assumed that they're sharing within households. So this is to say, this is the income of the households that the 0 to 4-year-olds actually live in. So it's mainly their parents' earnings, not their own earnings. But basically we see that on average children live in slightly poorer than average over the whole population households. And then, whereas teenagers and early young adults live in slightly richer households, they enter work, they don't have their own children, and remember we've adjusted for the fact they've had children, so if you don't have children, you don't need as much income to be, in this sense, richer in the equivalized sense. Then this dip in the early and mid 20s is due to then those people having their own children, having more people in their household, having to share that income with those people and having a lower living standards. And then, but their earnings tend to continue to rise, returns to experience, classic earnings, age earnings profiles. And also their kids tend to move out and live in households of their own when they reach 50, 60. And so these are the richest people over the age spectrum. And then pensioners in 1978, 79 were particularly poor. So people over the age of 70 had only around 65% of average income. How does that change over time? Well, moving to just before the recession, we can see that, okay, so younger people are slightly poorer. And the dip in the middle of life comes slightly later. It's probably due to people having children slightly later. But most strikingly, pensioners get much less poor. So pensioners in 1978-79 had around 65% of median income, but by 2007, 2008, they have, on average, they have about 80% of average income. And overall, mainly driven by this change in pensioners, you can see that this line has broadly got flatter. Like, the flatter this line, the less inequality there is across ages. And so between 1978 and 79 and 2007, 2008, there was a fall in inequality across ages. And actually bringing this up to the present day, or not quite the present day because it's an old graph, but this trend continues. The line gets flatter again. We're getting closer to the horizontal line at 100% of average income. Again, pensioners. It's pensioners getting richer, which is driving this. So over the last 30 years, we can see that inequality across ages was falling. But on the previous graph, I showed you that inequality over the whole population rose dramatically during the 1980s. So what must have happened? Well, this has been driven by a rise in inequality between ages. So what I've done here is take the 90-10 income ratio, so the same overall statistic that we talked about before for the whole population, and now define that within each of our different age groups. So what's the 90-10 income ratio? In 1978, 79, of those between the ages of 0 and 5. And you can see it's pretty stable across the distribution. So inequality within each group is stable, whether you're a very young child or whether you're in the middle of your life or whether you're a pensioner. The level with inequality within that age remains relatively stable. But inequality within those age groups rose massively over the next 30 years. So the income ratio, 90-10 income ratio, rose from about 0.25 to about 0.4. This is a larger rise than we saw in the whole population of the 90-10 income ratio, because we've got to account for the fact that income inequality between different ages actually fell. And bringing it up to the present day, very little again happens there. So inequality by age, so this basically summarizes what I've just said. So looking at the whole population misses some of the action of what's going on in terms of inequality. We see falls in inequality between different ages and rises in inequality across different ages. And as I only have 4 minutes left, I'm not sure it's worth me getting into the poverty section, so I won't get particularly far. But are there any questions on what I've done so far on inequality or measuring income at all? Yeah?
Can we just go back to the slides on age, inequality by age, about 3 or 4 slides ago?
These ones.
Is that not showing that younger people, sort of running between kind of 20 and 35, have got a bit worse off, and pensioners have got significantly better off, or much less worse off?
Yes, essentially that's what we're doing. So it's important to separate two different things that are going on. Because we're equivalising, we need to account for changes in the types of households that they're living in. So if 20-year-olds are more likely to have children in 1978, or 25-year-olds are more likely to have children, they're living in a bigger household. The same level of earnings, as it were, that they might be receiving will give them less equivalised household income. So that's one of the things that's going on. The other thing that's going on is young people fared particularly bad during the recession. They've saw much faster rises in their unemployment rate, and they saw much bigger wage falls, whereas employment and wages were relatively stable for those over the age of 30. So yes, particularly in the recession, young people got slightly poorer. But what's driving the fact that inequality across ages fell is this big change in pensioners. So pensioners were strikingly poor in 1978-79, and progressively over the next 30 years, and continued since the recession, though their incomes have moved more towards the overall median income we see across the population. And it's driven partly recently by it's driven by a couple of things. There's increases in the amount of private pension wealth that pensioners have. So each generation, so the population of pensioners, it's not the same people that have been given more money. It's a new generation of pensioners. And later and later generations of pensioners have saved more for their pensions. They've got more, they have more private income available in retirement. And also, pensioner benefits have been relatively well protected in recent years with the triple lock on pension credit. Yeah, any other questions? Yes?
So are they trying to use sort of show the problem with like an aging population? Because if the pension still receives a lot lower percentage of income, then maybe the aging population will be a lot less of a burden.
So it depends. I think the answer to that question depends on the sources of income that they're receiving. So if pensioners nowadays are saving a lot more for retirement, so they're less dependent on the state for their income, then potentially that would show that it's less of a burden on the state, that we've got more and more pensioners. If the part of the increase in the income of pensioners that we see, that's the part of that which is driven by increased generosity in pensioner benefits, that is dependent on the state. So the more people that are dependent on the now more generous pensioner benefits will increase the burden on the state of the ageing population. So there could be two factors that potentially offsetting under that. I don't know the relative importance of the two of them, I'm afraid. Yeah?
Do you have any predictions for inequality over the next decade?
Do I have any predictions? So one thing, as incomes return to growth, so we saw the reduction of, so we saw this fall in income inequality over the last 3 or 4 years. That was driven by the fact that earnings fell and employment rates fell, and they impact those at the top of the distribution more than they do those at the bottom of the distribution. As we see wages begin to rise and employment rates begin to recover, we might expect some of that trend to reverse. And then the other big change which is happening, there have been austerity has had cuts to benefits, and that introduced cuts to benefits, and that has an impact on those at the bottom of the distribution, reducing their incomes. So those two factors would lead inequality to rise over the coming years, but there are also a lot of other trends going on in the economy. So I don't have any firm forecast, but there are a couple of things that might be going on in the next couple of years. Any last questions? It's about time for your break to start. And William's returned if you want to berate him for a little bit as well. Yes?
I was just wondering about regional inequality, and in particular the difference over the years between London and the rest of the UK.
So we have looked at that in a report a couple of years ago, so I can point you in the direction of our report afterwards. So if you search Living Standards and Inequality 2014, we have median living standards by region. I don't have the data to hand. What you do find, what I can remember from that research, is that London has one of the highest average incomes, but it also has one of the highest poverty rates. London has a bigger rate of within-region inequality than many of the other regions, particularly when you adjust for income after housing costs. So that's what I was going to go on to talk about had we had 20 minutes or more longer. But yeah, so if you look at that, that has median income rates by different regions. Yeah, one last question.
Is the Gini coefficient the best measure we've got for inequality? Would it be best to use like an Atkinson index rather than just using the headline figure of Gini?
I've never actually looked into the specifics of an Atkinson index, but a couple of my colleagues use it in more detail. So if you want to talk about that in detail, I can point you in their direction. One of them's speaking later on, actually. A Gini coefficient is one measure of the dispersion. Like I talked about how the difference there. In recent years, there's differences emerged between the 90-10 ratio and the Gini coefficient. There's not one perfect measure which sums up inequality as we want to care about, as we think of it conceptually in our heads. A lot of people care about this big rise in the amount of income that the 1% has accrued over the top 1% has accrued over the last like 20 or 30 years. But is that what we care about when we think about inequality immediately, or do we care about how your income compares to those who live down your street? So there are lots of different things we care about. No one measure is going to perfectly combine all of those into an index which we can call inequality. So it's worth looking at these suite of measures, making sure that the trends we talk about in inequality and the Gini coefficient also stand up in the 90-10 ratio. And then that's why, as you say, it's most informative to look at the overall distribution, see what's happening when we look at those 52 graphs lined up next to one another. That's what gives us the broadest measure of inequality, but no one measure is going to be a perfect solution. But Alison, who's talking later, knows a lot more about the Atkinson index than I do, so if you're interested in that, speak to her. But yeah, thanks very much for listening, and enjoy your break, William.